Have you ever wondered why, in the most difficult times, God seems silent? On days when pain cries out, the sky closes in. We ask for a sign, an answer, relief, but all we get is silence. A silence that hurts. A silence that feels like abandonment. According to the WHO, more than 970 million people live with a mental disorder in the world, many of them crying out for meaning, for direction, for something greater. And yet they feel alone, as if their prayers are hitting an invisible wall. But what if the problem isn't the lack of an answer? What if the problem is our inability to listen? In this video, you'll discover why so many people wait for a voice from on high, while ignoring the whispers that are already in their lives, in the world, in their souls. We're going to reflect on God's silence, and how it can actually be our own deafness. Stay with me until the end, because this reflection could change not only the way you think about faith and spirituality, but also the way you deal with suffering, loneliness, and the meaning of life. The history of humanity is crisscrossed with supplications. Since ancient times, human beings have raised their eyes to heaven and cried out, "Why? Why this pain? Why this loss? Why the just suffering? Why the absence of justice?" And in many cases, what they get in response is silence. In the Bible, the book of Job is the starkest portrait of this experience. A righteous man, devastated by unimaginable losses, begs God for an explanation. His friends try to justify his suffering with simplistic answers. But what is most distressing is not the judgment of others. It is the divine silence that imposes itself for pages and pages. Job cries out, questions, revolts, and God remains silent. This drama is not just religious. It is profoundly human. In hospitals, in cemeteries, in dark rooms where no one can see, men and women weep and wait. And when heaven doesn't answer, an even greater pain arises. The feeling of abandonment. The wound of a love that doesn't show itself. But is God really silent? Or is what we call silence actually a kind of response that we haven't been educated to understand? The philosopher Blaise Pascal said, "The eternal silence of these infinite spaces terrifies me." And perhaps this is one of the greatest pains of existence, facing the immensity of life without guarantees, without a manual, without a voice telling us what to do. Because the truth is that we are used to asking for direction, and not listening for presence. In moments of crisis, we want a miracle, an intervention, a clear, indisputable sign. But the universe offers us time instead. Space. Silence. And that seems at first glance to be a kind of neglect. However, in many cases, the opposite is true. Silence can be a fertile field, a soil where the seed of awareness begins to sprout. But this requires a different kind of listening. Listening without words. A listening of the soul. And that's where the big turning point begins. Understanding that perhaps God isn't silent. It's we who shout too loudly to understand what he's saying. We live waiting for a great manifestation, a voice from heaven, an unquestionable revelation, something that will take us out of doubt, suffering, and loneliness. But perhaps this waiting is the greatest spiritual trap of our age. We become so focused on listening to something that comes from outside that we lose the ability to perceive what is already inside. Theologian Simone Weil wrote, "Attention, absolutely pure and unmixed, is prayer." This means that the presence of the divine can be precisely where we are not looking, in everyday life, in details, in the silence between words. God, or what represents this greater sacred, may speak to us not through thunder, but through the whisper of existence. Think of art, music that touches something inside you that you can't name, the sunset that suddenly makes you stop, the gaze of a stranger who recognizes you, the hug from a friend who arrives without being asked. All of this can be an answer. It can be communication. It can be sacred language. Kierkegaard, another essential thinker on this subject, said that faith begins where reason ends. He's not talking about denying logic, but about accepting that there are dimensions of life that can only be understood by listening to the invisible. That perception that comes when we silence the noise of the mind and let the heart speak. But here's the challenge. This listening requires presence. And perhaps the greatest absence of modern life is the absence of ourselves. We are physically present, but emotionally disconnected. We live on autopilot, chasing goals, doped up by stimuli with no time to feel. That's why, when the divine speaks through a tree, a gesture, a synchronicity, many people simply don't notice, because they expected something to impose itself, not something that required sensitivity. And then life, generous as it is, insists. It keeps talking. It keeps sending signals. It keeps trying to reach the depths of the soul. But only those who allow themselves to listen can understand. What about you? Have you ever experienced a moment when something seemingly small came to you as if it were a direct message? We live in a time when everything shouts, notifications, social networks, opinions, instant promises of happiness. The noise is constant, external and internal. And in this deafening environment, we have lost the ability to listen. Not just to listen to others, but to listen to ourselves, to listen to the invisible, listening to the sacred. This deafness is not new, but it has never been so profound. In the past, silence was part of everyday life, contemplation of nature, long walks, moments of prayer. Today, any space of silence is immediately filled by a headset, a screen, a distraction. Silence has become uncomfortable, even frightening. And here's the paradox. Many say that God no longer speaks, that the world is empty of spirituality. But what is actually happening is that we have stopped listening. Because listening requires pause. And pausing today is almost a revolutionary act. Spirituality requires listening. And listening requires space. But in a world where every second needs to be productive, stopping to simply feel is seen as weakness. So we replace faith with efficiency, prayer for productivity, inner connection with incessant stimuli. And when life falls apart, as it inevitably does, we run desperately to find something to fall back on. And then we ask, where is God? But perhaps the right question is, where am I when God tries to speak? The philosopher Byung-Chul Han talks about the society of weariness, where excessive positivity and self-exploration take us away from the dimension of mystery. We live so busy trying to be someone, to achieve something, to prove ourselves, that we forget to simply exist. And it is in simple existence, stripped of masks, that the sacred usually manifests itself. Spirituality doesn't need proof, it needs presence. And presence is something we're losing, not out of malice, but through excess, an excess of noise, anxiety, and speed. The sacred doesn't compete with noise. It waits, but it doesn't wait forever. Because the further we move away from listening, the more insensitive we become to the language of life. So if you feel that God is silent, stop and observe. Maybe it's just the world talking too loudly inside you. Maybe it's time to quieten down inside, to listen to what has always been there. There are times in life when everything seems to stop. Dreams lose their color, days drag on, and meaning seems to evaporate. It's emptiness. That state in which nothing fills, where words don't console and not even faith seems to make sense. Many see this emptiness as a punishment, a mistake, a spiritual failure. But what if it's actually an invitation? The spirituality of silence is one of the deepest forms of connection with the divine, but also one of the least understood. Because it doesn't offer quick answers or immediate sensations. It calls for surrender, courage, and a special kind of listening, that which happens within silence. Pascal said that all the problems of humanity come from man's inability to be alone, in silence, in his room. It is in this silent space, without distractions, that the soul begins to speak. But in order to listen to it, you have to endure the initial discomfort, the feeling of absence, of insignificance, of vulnerability. This is the fertile ground where the sacred reveals itself, not as a spectacle, but as a presence. Viktor Frankl, a concentration camp survivor and creator of logotherapy, said that life has meaning even in the face of suffering, and that human beings find this meaning when they stop looking outside for what can only be found inside. Silence, in this case, is not an absence of answers. It is the space where meaning can finally emerge. Rumi, the Persian mystic poet, wrote, "The soul has its own language. Don't try to hear it with your ears, but with your heart." This phrase reminds us that emptiness is often the removal of what is superficial so that what is essential can speak. And the essential speaks quietly. It never shouts. But listening takes practice. It requires giving up control. And above all, accepting that perhaps there are no absolute answers. Only better questions, only deeper states of presence. Emptiness, then, is not a hole to be avoided. It's a portal, a call, a crossing that separates what is noise from what is truth. When everything seems to cease, that's when the voice of the sacred can finally be heard. Not as a command, but as a gentle reassurance. You are not alone. Since we were children, we have been taught to associate the divine with the extraordinary. Miracles, apparitions, voices from beyond, revelations. We expect the sacred to manifest itself as something that interrupts logic, that challenges reality, that takes us out of the ordinary. But this expectation can be precisely what prevents us from seeing the divine where it reveals itself most, in everyday life. The truth is that many lose faith because they expect a spectacle, and when it doesn't come, they conclude that God doesn't exist, that spirituality is an illusion, or that they aren't worthy of a mystical experience. But aren't we just looking in the wrong place? The philosopher Martin Buber said that God is in the relationship between I and thou. In other words, God is not outside, but in the encounter, in the exchange between people, the moment someone really listens, in the gratuitous gesture of care, in the silent goodness that no one sees, but transforms the environment. Eckhart Tolle, a contemporary author who has influenced millions with the idea of the power of now, reinforces this by saying that the sacred is accessible at all times, but only reveals itself when we are truly present. The divine, in this sense, is not a distant entity, but a quality of attention. Have you ever noticed how an ordinary conversation can change everything when there is real presence? How a sunset seen with deep attention can seem like a prayer. How a coffee with a friend can become a sacred act if it is experienced with gratitude. This is not romanticizing life. This is applied spirituality. But there's a problem. Our culture has trained us to despise the ordinary. We have become accustomed to seeking meaning only in the extraordinary, forgetting that the ordinary is where life really happens. We expect miracles and miss out on blessings. We want answers from another world and ignore those that life already offers us every day. Waiting for the divine to come with lights and thunder is like ignoring the sound of rain because we want to hear a symphony. It's living deaf to the sacred because it didn't come the way we expected. So perhaps the real miracle is to change the way we see, exchanging the expectation of supernatural events for openness to the mystery of now. Because the now, in all its simplicity, already contains everything we need. What about you? When was the last time you saw something sacred in something apparently ordinary? Perhaps the biggest mistake in our spiritual quest is thinking that communication with the divine is something that is yet to happen, as if we needed an ideal moment, an intense experience, an intervention from above. But what if the truth is exactly the opposite? What if God, or what represents the sacred, has always been speaking, and it's just that we haven't learned to listen? This is an uncomfortable but liberating hypothesis, because it takes us out of passivity. It invites us to take responsibility. Instead of waiting for the sacred to reach us, we are challenged to purify our listening. God can speak through the voice of a child, through the pain of a loss, through the poetry hidden in a lonely walk, through the intuition that arises in the silence of the early morning, through the doubt that won't be silenced, through the beauty that shudders, through the presence that welcomes. But this requires sensitivity. And sensitivity is a construct, not a magical gift. Throughout this video, we go through anguish that many carry in silence, the pain of not feeling heard by God, the frustration of unanswered prayers, the confusion of not knowing what to believe in anymore. But perhaps the great answer is here, now, at this very moment. Listen differently. Perhaps you don't need to wait any longer. Perhaps the divine is already in everything. It just needs someone willing to notice. If this reflection has touched you in any way, enjoy the video now, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell. That way, you'll help us get this message across to other people who are also silently waiting for a sign. And if you believe in the importance of content like this, deep, human, made with responsibility and soul, consider making a donation of any amount here on the channel. Your help strengthens this work and allows more content like this to reach more people. Because there are many people in the world who need exactly that. A space to listen, to make sense, to be present. God's silence may only be our deafness, but together, we can relearn how to listen,